Hi guys. Tonight we begin by stepping quietly into the cold stone interior of a medieval castle. The air is heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wool, and you can almost feel the chill pressing against your skin even before you've crossed the threshold. It's the kind of place that looks solid and impressive from the outside, romantic even, but becomes something very different once the sun has gone down and the temperature begins to drop. You probably wouldn't survive this night. At least not without some tricks up your sleeve. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and your local time. I'd love to know where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights around you. Allow your breathing to slow. Let the pace of the night settle in. And what we're exploring tonight is not drama or danger, but the ordinary problem of how people manage to sleep inside these enormous stone buildings without freezing, night after night, year after year, long before central heating, insulated windows, or even the idea of personal comfort existed in the way we understand it today. You trudge across the flagstone floor of a great chamber, your boots scraping against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of feet. The cold bites at your skin even though you're fully dressed. Each breath you pull in forms a faint cloud in front of your face. The stone walls don't simply resist warmth. They swallow it whole. Historians often describe castles as marvels of defense, but rarely as marvels of comfort. And here's the blunt truth. Those same thick walls that could shrug off a battering ram also trapped cold air like a giant refrigerator. Once the sun dropped, the inside temperature plummeted almost as quickly as the outside. A mainstream fact worth remembering is that many castles in northern Europe were strategically placed on windswept hills. From a military standpoint, that was brilliant. You could see invaders coming, and the slopes gave you a defensive advantage. But from the perspective of someone trying to get some sleep, it was a curse. Wind scoured every surface and forced icy drafts through gaps in shutters and under doors. As darkness spreads through the corridors and chambers, the temperature inside drops steadily. Stone absorbs cold as easily as it absorbs heat, and once the warmth of the day fades, the walls begin to release that stored chill back into the rooms. The air feels heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. You can almost taste the bitterness of it clinging to your throat. So people living in castles did not approach sleep casually. They treated it as something that required preparation, layering, and patience. They started with clothing. People rarely undressed fully before bed. Instead, they kept on linen shifts, wool tunics, hose, and sometimes cloaks, adding layers rather than removing them. They knew from experience that bare skin meant losing warmth too quickly. Even the head was covered, often with a soft cloth cap. People believed, quite reasonably, that heat escaped fastest there. A curious little tidbit from medieval medical texts suggests that physicians thought the body needed to trap vapors in the skull during sleep. Whether that was scientifically accurate or not, the practice kept heads warm, which is what mattered. As evening progressed, fires were tended earlier rather than later. Not to warm the entire space, which was impossible, but to reduce the sharpness of the cold before night fully set in. This allowed bodies and fabrics to absorb as much warmth as they could before retreating to sleeping areas. You picture yourself lingering by the hearth in the great hall, unwilling to leave, stretching your hands to soak up every last spark of warmth. Your cheeks glow hot, but the back of your body already feels the cold creeping in, reminding you of what waits upstairs. Historians still debate whether some castles developed more sophisticated heating systems for their great halls. A few argue that vents and flues allowed warmth to circulate, especially in later centuries. Others suggest this is wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval building technology simply didn't prioritize comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. The Great Hall was warm only in the immediate vicinity of the fire and nowhere else. Fires would burn low or be allowed to die out during the night to reduce risk. Many households chose to let fires die down completely overnight, trusting layers and routine instead. This decision meant that mornings were often bitterly cold. And beds themselves. They were positioned with care, raised high above the floor where the coldest air gathered, often set away from exterior walls, surrounded by heavy curtains suspended from wooden frames. You can almost hear the rustle of thick fabric as the bed curtains are drawn closed. The sound of breathing, soft and steady. The faint creak of wooden bed frames settling under weight. These curtains created a small enclosed space inside a much larger room. A space where breath, body heat, and thick bedding could slowly raise the temperature by a few precious degrees. And while that difference may sound small, it was often enough to make sleep possible. The bed curtains acted almost like doors that could be opened or closed by degrees, controlling airflow without fully exposing the sleeper. Over time, people became skilled at managing these small changes without fully waking, making sleep a fluid state rather than a fixed one, especially when combined with layers of blankets, made from wool, linen, and sometimes fur. Laid thick and heavy, pressing down gently to trap warmth while discouraging unnecessary movement. Because people learned that staying still conserved heat better than shifting and turning. And beneath all of this, the mattress itself mattered. Whether it was a feather bed filled with down that trapped air efficiently, or a straw-filled tick that provided separation from cold boards. Now here's an odd detail that shows up in household inventories from the straw mattress. Bedding the fabric often beneath you as you settle in. Coverlets, the smell of wool and smoke and furs rather than a single heavy covering. Shifts at your feet. This wasn't about warmth or display. And as the night went on, the castle which allowed adjustment as the night progressed. Wind if someone woke feeling too cold, they could pull another layer closer without guards moving along corridors to the air. Their footsteps these materials were maintained carefully to keep them dry through the structure because dampness made of it cold more severe and more difficult to endure, forming part of the background of rest. Stone you can picture it clearly, rarely dry places, lying beneath those the heavy thick walls that enclosed enemies also trapped listening to the wind press against the walls surviving outside. The night involved the darkness bedding as complete. Dry as possible. The cold is present, blankets during the day when weather allowed. By morning, avoiding direct contact with walls that not because the castle was warm, to the touch, but because people had learned to work with the cold rather than fight slightly away using from stone layers, surfaces, shared space, even if space was limited, beds, and throughout the castle, endure the night. People often slept close together. Repetitive process not that for privacy what or romance inside medieval warmth. Castles for centuries. Family members, as servants, the night continues inside the castle and the last usable warmth from the evening fire fades, and sleep becomes less about comfort and more about maintaining because their bodies added heat. People their presence beneath layers of fabric sentimental to pay attention to small details that matter over many hours in bed first, such as using them as living hot water bottles before slipping under the covers themselves in through gaps in shutters. Some historians and suggest how moisture in the air settles among noble women in particular. You notice the way the air feels against your face when you breathe. Cool but not sharp. The fabric of your shift slightly damp where it touches your neck. the weight of the blankets pressing down on your shoulders. Additional cloth hangings or wooden screens were placed between sleepers and the masonry, not to make the room warm, but to soften the cold enough that the body could relax rather than remain tense all night. Beneath the blankets, people often tucked extra garments around their feet and legs, since extremities lost heat fastest. Cold feet could make sleep impossible. So socks, spare tunics, or folded cloaks were pressed into service as insulation. Hands were sometimes kept tucked against the body or beneath the blanket edge to preserve warmth. You imagine your own hands pulled close to your chest, fingers curled inward, and breathing itself became part of the process. As the enclosed space of the bed slowly filled with warmer air from repeated breaths, creating a faint pocket of heat that people learned not to disturb unnecessarily. When several people shared a bed or slept closely nearby, this effect increased. Multiple bodies contributed warmth, making shared sleeping arrangements practical even among those who might otherwise prefer solitude. And in colder months, this closeness was often accepted without comment, because survival outweighed personal preference. A quirky note from some village records mentions that people sometimes used this midnight waking to check on neighbors or even tend to small tasks. Life did not stop completely, even when the world was asleep. Throughout the night, small adjustments were made almost unconsciously. Pulling a blanket tighter, shifting slightly to avoid a draft, tucking fabric back into place. All done slowly to avoid letting cold air rush inside. And while sleep might come in shorter stretches rather than deep, uninterrupted rest, these periods were enough to restore strength, especially when combined with the knowledge that morning would bring movement, fire, and renewed warmth. There's still some disagreement among researchers about sleep patterns in this period. Some argue that segmented sleep, where people woke naturally after a few hours and remained awake briefly before sleeping again, was mainly a rural phenomenon. Others believe even castle dwellers followed the same rhythm. Evidence from diaries, court records, and letters from across Europe suggests that people did not sleep through the night in one long stretch. Instead, they had what chroniclers called the first sleep and the second sleep, two distinct phases separated by an hour or two of wakefulness. You imagine yourself waking after a few hours, eyes blinking in the faint glow of embers. The room is quiet, yet alive with the soft movements of others stirring too. This is the hour between sleeps, the calmest moment of the night, when time feels suspended. A peasant might rise after midnight, poke the fire, check the animals, or murmur a few prayers before returning to bed. A noble might read from a psalter or speak quietly with a servant. Some records from monasteries suggest that monks even timed their night prayers around this rhythm, calling it the watch. It was both a spiritual exercise and a necessity, for the cold demanded movement. To sit still too long was to invite numbness. The scientific understanding of this pattern has fascinated modern researchers. When people are placed in complete darkness without clocks or artificial light, their bodies often revert to a similar cycle. Sleeping for 4 hours, waking for 1 or 2, then sleeping again. It seems our ancestors were not strange, but rather perfectly attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. And in some castles, especially larger ones, night watches moved quietly through corridors, their presence serving both security and safety, since an unattended fire or fallen ember could be as dangerous as the cold itself. You listen to the distant footsteps of a guard changing watch. the faint scrape of boots on stone. The sound reassures you rather than disturbs you. Everything is in order. And so sleep in medieval castles was shaped not by luxury, but by routine, habit, and acceptance. Built from countless nights of quiet adjustment, where people learned to work with the limitations of their environment rather than resist them, finding rest not in warmth itself, but in the careful management of cold resources allowed. Additional measures were sometimes used, and the steady rhythm of night giving way near the fire and placing them near the bed, as winter stretched on and nights lengthened, where they released people inside medieval over several hours, these habits often near the feet where learning was most repetition, which although this practice made the greatest difference, it was known one of the most important lessons and labor allowed. Because especially during severe cold, when darkness fell, alongside but when the remaining floor coverings such as rushes or straw were stored in thickly across stone floors and to reduce cold rising from below. So evenings were often moisture and softening or in the great hall where a larger fire burned. Regular replacement, not because it could heat the entire room, pests, but because sitting near the floor of your chamber and blankets covered in a thick layer of dried rushes be carried into bed. The faint herbal scent picture yourself wrapped in your cloak, your feet standing as close to them as you dare. The cold of the stone below against your front while your back remains cool. And while these measures did not make castle interiors like warm by modern standards, trying to warm they created a layered environment where cold was slowed, and once people withdrew to their chambers, that stored psychologically this mattered as much as physically. Even because knowing that one had done everything possible to prepare for the night, same principles applied to relax rather than remain stone behaved the same everywhere. And this mental shift was essential for rest steadily and especially without pause. In a setting where absolute comfort was unattainable. People relied on accumulation. One of the most telling images is the transition stacking itself. Thin layers the walk instead from the great hall to your source of heat. Knowing that many small barriers worked better than one into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft hits you instantly. A knife of cold air rushing through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. Your breath fogs again. The warmth you just carried in your bones drains away as though the castle itself is feeding on it. That shift from one room of temporary comfort to the endless chill beyond defined medieval nights. Sometimes nobles lingered so long in the great hall that they practically slept there. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth could serve as a makeshift bed, and servants or guards often collapsed near the embers rather than face their chambers. To sleep near the fire was to risk sparks, smoke, and restless noise. But compared to the icy stone above, it was still tempting. Another curious note from the records. Travelers often complained more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than the sleep itself. That brief exposure, moving from warmth into cold, was described as a shock to the body. People spoke of shivers lasting all night because of that walk. It's as if the castle itself punished you for daring to think you might be comfortable. And so sleep in medieval castles was shaped not by conquest of the cold, but by negotiation with it. Nightly patience. Small habits accumulated across time. The simple act of sleeping became an expression of accumulated knowledge, passed down silently through generations who learned, night after night, how to live within stone walls without freezing. Not through innovation or comfort, but through routine, cooperation, and an acceptance of the limits imposed by their world. As centuries passed and castles evolved in size and design, the fundamental experience of sleeping within them changed very little. Because although new rooms were added and layouts became more complex, the materials remained largely the same. Stone continued to dominate walls, floors, and ceilings, preserving the same challenges that earlier generations had faced. So even as certain comforts increased slightly, such as better quality textiles or more elaborate beds for those of higher status, the nightly routine of preparing for cold remained familiar, and people continued to rely on methods that had proven reliable rather than experimental solutions, since survival favored what was known to work. And this meant that even small habits became deeply ingrained, repeated nightly without conscious thought, such as closing shutters at a certain time, blocking cracks with cloth, positioning bedding to avoid airflow from corridors. Within shared chambers, people became accustomed to each other's presence. The sound of breathing, occasional movement, quiet coughing blending into the background of rest. And rather than disturbing sleep, this familiarity often made it easier to relax, since it signaled normalcy and continuity. And in this way, the social environment of sleep reinforced the physical one, helping individuals feel secure enough to rest despite the cold. You lie there listening to the soft breathing of others in the chamber. Someone shifts slightly, blankets rustling. A quiet cough from the corner. The sounds are comforting rather than intrusive. You are not alone in this cold night. And for those sleeping alone, such as guards on duty or servants resting between shifts, the absence of shared warmth was compensated for with extra layers, tighter bedding, or proximity to interior walls, showing how flexible the system was, adapting to circumstance rather than depending on fixed arrangements. And while extreme cold could still make nights uncomfortable, especially during harsh winters, most people learned to expect this variation and adjusted their routines accordingly. Perhaps sleeping longer in the morning, resting during daylight, or conserving energy to reduce the body's demand for warmth. And these adjustments were not seen as failures, but as sensible responses to the environment. And over time, this approach shaped attitudes toward comfort itself, lowering expectations and emphasizing resilience, so that warmth was appreciated when available but not assumed, and rest was valued even when imperfect. And this mindset allowed people to function consistently in conditions that might otherwise seem as bodies settled into predictable positions. These small habits pulled into familiar configurations, and quiet adjustments form a picture of medieval bed gradually becoming less about hardship and more about adaptation. Not warm in an absolute sense, not conquered but managed, but consistent enough to allow the body to slow its movements and enter rest. And where the simple act of sleeping became an expression because of unpredictability made cold more difficult to tolerate through generations who learned allowed the body to adapt. How to conserving energy and regulating temperature more efficiently, not through innovation or comfort, the castle contributed to this process. Cooperation, the steady rhythm of wind of the limits imposed by their world, the distant steps of a guard. As this quiet system continued to operate without interruption, these became signals that everything was an obstacle to sleep, allowing sleepers to remain relaxed whose moods were understood. And when interruptions occurred, so people learned which rooms stayed colder shifting longer, weather, which stairwells carried drafts people downward, responded not and which corners of a chamber felt slightly more sheltered, fabric closer, and this awareness influenced not only where people waiting slept, quietly but how they arranged their belongings, trusting that the structure and routine would hold, or hanging cloths. And this strategically was to break airflow and create pockets of stillness, tighten the body, because and increase air the sensation of cold, even when the temperature remained low. Muscles to loosen, and over time these small choices accumulated into an internal map of warmth and emotional steadiness became as important without physical to articulate it, shaping how people experienced night within castle walls. And as dawn approached and the cold reached its deepest point, Sleepers often drifted in and out of light rest rather than deep sleep, conserving energy until movement and fire returned. And when morning finally arrived, marked by pale light filtering through shutters or the sound of activity beginning elsewhere in the castle, the transition out of bed was slow and deliberate. Blankets folded back reluctantly, limbs stretched cautiously, feet placed carefully on cold floors, knowing that the body needed time to adjust. And this slow beginning to the day mirrored the slow preparation of the night before, reinforcing a rhythm that valued gradual change rather than abrupt shifts. And through this rhythm, people maintained their health and endurance, not by eliminating discomfort, but by pacing themselves within it. And so sleeping in medieval castles was not an act of passive endurance, but an ongoing process of quiet cooperation between people, materials, and space, repeated night after night with little variation, allowing life to continue steadily within stone walls that were never truly warm, but consistently survivable through habit, awareness, and patience. And as these practices carried forward across generations, they shaped a culture of rest that accepted cold as a condition to be managed rather than feared, making sleep possible not through comfort, but through familiarity, routine, and the steady confidence that morning would come again. And with that confidence settled into the background of daily life, the experience of sleeping in a medieval castle became something quietly habitual rather than remarkable. So people no longer thought of the cold as an event, but as a condition that framed everything they did after sunset, influencing how they moved, spoke, and eventually rested. And this awareness extended even to the timing of sleep itself, since many castle inhabitants did not expect to sleep deeply for a continuous stretch as modern people often do, but instead experienced rest in phases, drifting in and out of lighter sleep as the night progressed, waking briefly to adjust coverings, respond to sounds, or simply reposition themselves before settling again. And this pattern was not considered a problem but a normal response to an environment where temperature, noise, and shared space made uninterrupted rest unlikely. And because these awakenings were expected, they caused little frustration, allowing the body to relax again quickly rather than remain alert. And over time, this acceptance reduced the strain that cold nights might otherwise place on the mind. And alongside this, daily labor played an important role in making sleep possible, since physical work during daylight hours naturally increased fatigue, helping people fall asleep even in imperfect conditions. And this applied equally to servants, craftsmen, guards, and nobles, whose days, though different in nature, still required sustained effort that left the body ready for rest once night arrived. And when combined with routine, this fatigue helped override discomfort, allowing sleep to arrive gradually despite the cold. And in particularly harsh winters, people adapted further, by conserving energy whenever possible, limiting unnecessary movement, sharing spaces more densely, and relying even more heavily on layered bedding and enclosed beds. And while illness was always a risk in cold, damp environments, the consistency of these practices reduced that risk enough for castle life to continue across generations, demonstrating that survival depended less on eliminating hardship and more on managing it steadily. And when viewed quietly, without drama, the way people slept in medieval castles reflects a broader pattern of medieval life itself, where endurance was built from repetition, modest adjustments, and shared knowledge rather than innovation or comfort. And sleep became one more daily task approached with care and patience, integrated seamlessly into a life shaped by stone walls, limited heat, and the slow passing of seasons, until eventually these methods became so ordinary that they faded into the background, unnoticed yet essential, allowing people to close their eyes at night within cold castles, trusting not in warmth, but in routine, familiarity, and the quiet assurance that they knew how to get through the night. And as that assurance remained quietly in place, the night inside the castle continued to unfold in a steady, uneventful way, with nothing sudden or remarkable to disturb the balance people had learned to maintain. And this lack of interruption was important, because predictability allowed both body and mind to remain at ease, even in cold conditions. And so the hours passed, marked only by subtle changes, such as the gradual cooling of the air as embers faded completely, the deepening stillness of corridors as footsteps became less frequent, and the way breathing slowed as sleepers settled more fully into rest. And in this environment, the bed functioned not as a place of luxury but as a practical refuge, a carefully arranged space that gathered warmth slowly and released it just as slowly. And people trusted this process, knowing from experience that if they remained still, kept coverings in place, and avoided unnecessary movement, their bodies would retain enough heat to remain comfortable enough for sleep. And this trust extended to the structure around them as well, since castles, despite their cold, offered protection from wind and precipitation, preventing the far harsher conditions of the outdoors from intruding directly. And this contrast mattered, because even a cold stone room felt manageable compared to open exposure. And so the castle at night became a kind of buffer zone between the body and the elements, imperfect but reliable. And within it, people adjusted their expectations accordingly, finding contentment not in warmth but in stability. And this perspective shaped how they remembered their nights, which were rarely described as miserable or unbearable in records, but simply as normal, unremarkable, and part of life. And this ordinariness is perhaps the most telling detail, because it shows that over time the cold lost its power to dominate attention, becoming instead a background condition that required response but not reaction. And this allowed people to sleep without anxiety, even when temperatures dropped low, because anxiety itself was understood to worsen discomfort, and calm acceptance made endurance easier. And so the long nights of winter passed quietly, punctuated by rest, brief waking moments, and eventual daylight. And when spring returned and temperatures eased, the same routines relaxed slightly but never disappeared entirely, remaining ready to be resumed when cold returned. And in this way, the experience of sleeping in medieval castles formed a continuous cycle rather than a seasonal struggle, shaped by habits that worked across time rather than quick solutions, allowing generations of people to live, rest, and recover within stone walls that were never warm, but consistently survivable through patience, repetition, and a deep familiarity with the rhythm of night. And with that rhythm firmly established, the castle at night became a space where nothing needed to be solved, only followed. And people moved through their routines with a kind of quiet certainty, knowing when to withdraw from the fire, when to settle into bed, and when to remain still, letting the layers around them do their work. And over time, this predictability softened the experience of cold, not by changing the temperature, but by changing how it was perceived, because familiarity reduced resistance, and resistance was often what made discomfort feel sharper. And as bodies adapted to these conditions over years of repeated exposure, they became more efficient at conserving heat, slowing movement, maintaining circulation even in low temperatures, especially when supported by thick clothing and shared warmth. And this physiological adaptation worked alongside habit, reinforcing the idea that survival was not dependent on constant effort, but on alignment with the environment. And within the castle, this alignment expressed itself through stillness, through patience, and through an acceptance that night was not a time for activity or comfort, but for quiet preservation. And this perspective shaped everything, from how people positioned themselves in bed to how they breathed, often pulling blankets higher and tucking chins downward to reduce exposed skin, instinctively minimizing heat loss without conscious thought. And these small postures became so ingrained that they were rarely noticed, passed down not through instruction but through imitation, as younger people observed how older ones slept and adjusted themselves accordingly. And even when visitors unfamiliar with castle life struggled during their first nights, locals understood that adaptation would come, just as it had for them, through repetition rather than explanation. And in this way, the castle functioned as both shelter and teacher, shaping behavior subtly over time. And although later centuries would introduce fireplaces in more rooms, glazed windows, and eventually better heating methods, the core experience of sleeping in a stone structure remained similar for a long period, grounded in the same principles of layering, enclosure, shared space, and routine. And when viewed without romanticism or hardship, this way of sleeping appears neither heroic nor miserable, but simply functional. A quiet solution developed through lived experience rather than design. And this functionality allowed people to rest sufficiently to continue their lives within castles that were built for defense rather than comfort, proving that sleep did not require warmth in an absolute sense, but only enough stability for the body to let go. And so night after night, beneath stone ceilings and behind drawn curtains, people closed their eyes not expecting ease, but trusting familiarity. And that trust, more than any fire or fabric, is what allowed them to sleep without freezing, carried forward silently across generations as part of the ordinary texture of medieval life. And with that quiet familiarity guiding each night, people within the castle continued to treat sleep as a gradual settling rather than a sudden event, allowing the body to ease into rest as the environment slowly cooled. And this slow descent into night was supported by habits that discouraged haste, such as finishing tasks earlier, moving more deliberately, minimizing unnecessary trips through cold corridors once evening routines were complete, because every movement through open space exposed the body to drafts and temperature shifts that were difficult to recover from afterward. And so stillness became valuable long before anyone lay down, shaping how evenings were spent and how energy was conserved. And once in bed, people relied on the accumulated warmth of the day, held in layers of cloth and flesh, to carry them through the hours ahead, understanding that heat was something to be saved rather than generated. And this mindset extended even to breathing, which slowed naturally as sleepers relaxed, reducing heat loss and helping the enclosed space within bed curtains remain stable. And although the air within these small enclosures was never warm in a modern sense, it was consistent, and consistency was enough, allowing muscles to loosen and rest to arrive in quiet intervals. And when sleep was interrupted by cold or discomfort, the response was rarely frustration, but simple adjustment. A hand pulling fabric closer, a knee drawing inward, a shoulder turning slightly away from a draft. All done with minimal movement to preserve warmth. And these small actions were learned through repetition rather than explanation, becoming instinctive over time. And in shared chambers, this rhythm was synchronized across bodies, as people moved carefully to avoid disturbing others, maintaining a collective stillness that benefited everyone by preserving the fragile balance of heat within the room. And through this shared awareness, sleep became a cooperative state rather than an individual pursuit, reinforcing the idea that survival inside cold stone walls depended not on personal comfort, but on collective restraint, patience, and a willingness to adapt quietly to the limits imposed by the night. And as this collective restraint settled more deeply into daily life, the castle at night took on a rhythm that felt almost suspended, where time seemed to slow as activity diminished and the focus shifted inward, toward preservation rather than progress. And people became attuned to the subtle signals that marked the passage of hours, such as the deepening quiet after late evening tasks ended, the way shadows stopped moving once fires burned low, and the slight change in air as exterior temperatures dropped further toward dawn. And these signals guided behavior without the need for clocks or strict schedules, allowing sleepers to respond naturally by drawing coverings closer, settling more firmly into stillness, or drifting into lighter rest when deeper sleep became difficult. And this flexibility mattered, because rigid expectations about sleep would have clashed with the realities of cold stone environments. So instead, people accepted variability as normal, trusting that rest could come in fragments rather than a single continuous stretch. And over time, this acceptance reduced tension, making the body less reactive to discomfort. And within enclosed beds, the microclimate remained relatively stable, shaped by breath, fabric, and shared warmth. And although the air might feel heavy or faintly stale, this was preferable to the sharp chill beyond the curtains. And so beds remained closed spaces through most of the night, opened only briefly when adjustment was necessary. And when people slept on pallets or benches without curtains, they compensated by clustering more closely or adding additional layers beneath and above them, again relying on accumulation rather than intensity. And this approach extended to how bedding was arranged on the body, with heavier coverings placed toward the edges to seal in warmth, and lighter layers nearer the skin to trap air without compressing it too tightly. And these arrangements were adjusted subtly as the night progressed, often without full waking, reflecting a familiarity so deep that it no longer required conscious thought. And through this quiet negotiation with cold, sleep became less about escape and more about balance. A steady maintenance of warmth sufficient to allow the body to rest, even if comfort in the modern sense remained out of reach. And by dawn, this balance had done its work, leaving sleepers tired but functional, preserved rather than refreshed, ready to rise slowly and begin the cycle again. And once morning routines were completed and the day's activity began, the memory of the cold night receded quickly. Not because it had been severe or mild, but because it was expected. And this expectation shaped how people approached the following evening without anxiety or anticipation, treating sleep as a predictable task rather than a challenge. And during daylight hours, bedding was often aired when conditions allowed. Blankets draped over benches or railings near fires to release moisture and regain loft, because compressed or damp materials lost their insulating ability, and maintaining them was essential to the success of the night ahead. And clothing worn to bed was likewise managed carefully, dried and stored where it would remain usable, since changing into cold garments at night defeated the purpose of layering. And this attention to preparation reflected an understanding that warmth was cumulative, built gradually over time rather than summoned at the last moment. And within the castle structure itself, minor adjustments were made seasonally, with additional hangings added as winter deepened, shutters reinforced, sleeping spaces relocated slightly to more sheltered areas when necessary, showing that sleep arrangements were flexible rather than fixed, responding to weather and circumstance. And this adaptability reduced strain, allowing people to respond to colder nights with practical changes rather than endurance alone. And over years of repetition, these patterns became second nature, reducing the mental effort required to manage them, so that by the time night arrived, the body recognized familiar cues and began to settle automatically, conserving energy and warmth in anticipation of rest. And this recognition eased the transition into sleep even when temperatures were low, because the body trusted the system that had carried it safely through many nights before. And so the experience of sleeping in a medieval castle became less about confronting cold and more about participating in a routine that worked reliably, night after night, without requiring attention, innovation, or struggle. And as this reliability reinforced itself over countless repetitions, people within the castle began to associate the approach of night not with discomfort, but with a familiar sequence of actions that led naturally toward rest. And this association mattered because it allowed the mind to quiet itself in advance, reducing the vigilance that cold environments often provoke. And with vigilance lowered, the body conserved heat more effectively, muscles loosening rather than remaining tense, breathing slowing instead of staying shallow. And these subtle physiological shifts made a noticeable difference over long hours, even when temperatures remained low. And in this way, habit functioned as insulation just as much as wool or fur, buffering the body against stress that would otherwise magnify the sensation of cold. And within shared chambers, this calm spread easily, since one person's stillness encouraged another's, creating a collective quiet that supported rest. And interruptions were absorbed gently rather than escalating into wakefulness, because they were framed as normal rather than alarming. And even in rooms where drafts persisted or stone surfaces radiated cold steadily, the predictability of the environment allowed sleepers to adapt their posture and position gradually, finding arrangements that minimized exposure without conscious effort. And over time, these arrangements became so ingrained that they were repeated almost automatically, night after night, without experimentation or adjustment, because consistency worked better than novelty. And this preference for the familiar extended to all aspects of nighttime life, including the placement of personal belongings, the order in which garments were removed or retained, and the way bedding was folded back in the morning to prepare it for the next use, all of which contributed quietly to the success of sleep when evening returned. And although none of these actions produced warmth on their own, Together they created a stable framework within which rest could occur, allowing people to sleep not because the castle was warm, but because it was known, and because knowledge, accumulated slowly and applied gently, proved sufficient to carry the body through the cold hours of the night. And within this framework of familiarity, the castle itself seemed to recede into the background during the night, no longer demanding attention but simply existing as the constant shell around its inhabitants. And this allowed sleepers to focus less on their surroundings and more on the internal signals of the body, noticing when warmth felt sufficient and when a small adjustment was needed. And because these signals were subtle, they were responded to slowly, without urgency, preserving the calm that made rest possible. And over time, people became adept at making these adjustments almost without waking. A slight pull of fabric, a careful turn of the shoulder, a gentle tuck of feet closer to the body, all performed in a way that maintained the enclosed pocket of warmth rather than disrupting it. And this skill reduced the number of full awakenings during the night, allowing sleep to continue in soft intervals even as temperatures dipped further toward dawn. And in larger castles where chambers varied widely in size and exposure, individuals learned the particular character of each room, knowing which felt colder in high winds, which retained dampness after rain, and which were most stable across seasons. And this knowledge guided sleeping arrangements when possible, with people gravitating toward spaces that felt more predictable. And even when choice was limited, awareness itself provided comfort, because understanding why a room felt cold made it easier to accept, and acceptance in turn reduced tension. And throughout the night, this quiet understanding acted as a stabilizing force, allowing the castle's inhabitants to rest not because conditions were ideal, but because they were familiar. And familiarity softened the edges of discomfort, turning cold from an intrusive force into a steady presence that could be accommodated through routine, posture, and patience. And so sleep continued, supported not by warmth alone, but by the accumulated confidence that the night would pass as it always had, gradually and without incident, leading eventually to morning and the return of movement, sound, and activity within the stone walls. And as this confidence deepened further, the act of sleeping within the castle became almost invisible to thought, something done without reflection because it had proven itself reliable over time. And this invisibility was important, since anything that demanded constant attention risked breaking rest, while routines that faded into the background allowed the mind to loosen its grip and drift. And so people no longer evaluated the cold each night, but simply responded to it through habits that were already in place, trusting layers, positioning, and stillness to do their work. And this trust reduced the mental effort associated with rest, allowing sleep to arrive even when the body remained aware of its surroundings. And within this state, sleep was not deep or heavy in the modern sense, but sufficient, arriving in waves that carried the body through the night without exhaustion. And these waves were shaped by the environment itself, influenced by the gradual cooling of the air, the settling of the building, and the quiet presence of others nearby. And rather than resisting these influences, sleepers moved with them, allowing their rest to adjust naturally to changes in temperature and sound. And over time, this adaptability strengthened, making each night easier to endure than the last, even when conditions remained the same. And this gradual easing into acceptance had lasting effects. shaping how people viewed hardship more broadly, teaching them that endurance did not require constant struggle, but steady alignment with circumstance. And within the castle, this lesson was reinforced nightly. As people lay beneath heavy coverings, enclosed by stone, feeling the cold remain present but manageable. And this management was enough, allowing rest to continue quietly until the pale light of morning returned, signaling not relief from the cold, but the next repetition of a cycle that had already proven itself dependable. And with each repetition of this cycle, the distinction between discomfort and danger became clearer, allowing people to rest without fear even when conditions were far from comfortable. Because experience taught them that cold, when approached correctly, could be endured without causing harm. And this understanding eased the mind in ways that physical measures alone could not, since anxiety tightened the body and increased heat loss, while calm acceptance allowed warmth to be conserved more efficiently. And so night after night, the castle's inhabitants settled into sleep with a steady confidence that bordered on indifference. Not because they ignored the cold, but because they knew how to live alongside it. And this knowledge shaped their posture in bed, often curled slightly inward to protect the core, limbs tucked close, blankets drawn high, minimizing exposed surface area in a way that became instinctive over time. And these positions were maintained for long periods, reducing movement and preserving heat. And when movement was necessary, it was done slowly and deliberately, avoiding sudden shifts that might allow cold air to rush in. And this careful pacing extended even to breathing, which slowed naturally as bodies relaxed, reducing the exchange of warm air for cold. And within the enclosed space of a curtained bed or shared chamber, this collective stillness created an environment where the temperature changed very little hour by hour, allowing sleep to continue without interruption. And although the cold never truly disappeared, it lost its urgency, becoming a steady background condition rather than an active threat. And this transformation was perhaps the most important factor in allowing people to sleep in medieval castles. Because once the cold was understood and anticipated, it no longer demanded attention. And attention could turn inward toward rest, letting the night pass quietly until dawn returned light and movement to the stone halls. And as this inward focus became more established, the night inside the castle felt increasingly contained, as though the boundaries of the bed or sleeping space defined the entire world until morning. And this narrowing of attention was useful, because it reduced awareness of the larger, colder structure beyond the immediate area of rest, allowing the mind to settle on what was close, familiar, and manageable. And in this way, the enclosed bed, the shared pallet, or the layered coverings became the primary reference points for comfort, rather than the temperature of the room as a whole. And people learned to judge their state not by how cold the air felt when they moved, but by whether their core remained steady and their breathing slow. And this shift in perception made cold less intrusive, because it no longer defined the experience of the night, but existed alongside it. And as a result, sleep became something that happened within a small, controlled zone, largely independent of the broader environment. And this separation was reinforced by darkness itself, which limited visual cues and encouraged stillness, making it easier to remain settled once a comfortable position was found. And even when sounds traveled through stone walls or along corridors, they were softened by distance and familiarity, rarely interpreted as urgent, and so they pass through awareness without fully waking the sleeper. And over time, this selective attention became habitual, allowing people to remain asleep even when conditions were imperfect, because their focus remained anchored to the immediate sensations of warmth, weight, and enclosure. And this anchoring supported rest in a way that did not depend on eliminating cold, but on minimizing its relevance, allowing the body to continue its quiet work of recovery until the gradual return of light signaled the end of the night. And as this minimization of the wider environment took hold, the experience of sleeping within the castle became increasingly inward and self-contained, shaped less by the architecture around the sleeper and more by the small, repeated sensations that signaled safety and continuity, such as the steady pressure of layered blankets, the familiar weight of fabric against the shoulders, and the muted warmth held close to the body. And these sensations formed a kind of quiet reassurance that replaced any concern about the cold beyond the bed, allowing the mind to disengage gradually from its surroundings. And this disengagement was not sudden or complete, but gentle and partial, permitting light sleep to deepen slowly when conditions allowed, and to lift again when adjustments were needed, without fully breaking rest. And in this way, sleep unfolded as a fluid process rather than a fixed state, responsive to temperature, sound, and bodily comfort without being controlled by them. And people accepted this fluidity as normal, understanding that rest did not require perfect stillness or warmth, only sufficient stability to allow the body to recover. And within this understanding, the cold lost much of its power, because it no longer represented an unknown or threatening force, but a predictable presence that could be managed through posture, layering, and patience. And this predictability supported a sense of continuity across nights, making each evening feel familiar even as seasons changed. And as familiarity increased, the effort required to maintain warmth decreased, because habits replaced conscious decision-making, allowing sleepers to respond automatically to discomfort with minimal disruption. And through this process, the act of sleeping in a medieval castle became less about enduring hardship and more about participating in a well-established rhythm, one that balanced the limitations of stone, climate, and technology with the body's capacity to adapt quietly over time, sustaining rest not through comfort, but through consistency and acceptance. And with consistency firmly in place, the castle at night became a setting where effort was reduced to the minimum necessary, allowing the body to conserve energy rather than expend it resisting conditions that could not be changed. And this conservation extended beyond physical movement into thought itself, as people learned not to dwell on the cold or anticipate discomfort, since anticipation often sharpened sensation, while neutrality softened it. And so the mind was allowed to remain passive, drifting without focus as sleep approached, supported by the knowledge that nothing was required of it until morning. And this mental quiet was reinforced by the simplicity of the nighttime environment, where darkness limited stimulation and the absence of activity reduced decision-making, creating conditions where rest could arrive naturally even in imperfect comfort. And within shared sleeping spaces, this quiet spread easily, as one person's stillness encouraged another's, creating a collective calm that held throughout the night. And even when external sounds carried through stone corridors or whined pressed against shutters, these disturbances were absorbed into the background, registered briefly and then released, because they fit within an expected pattern rather than signaling change. And this expectation was crucial, since unexpected cold or noise demanded attention, while expected conditions could be ignored. And over time, this ability to ignore became a skill in itself, allowing people to sleep through circumstances that might otherwise keep them awake. And in this way, the success of sleeping in medieval castles depended not on overcoming the cold, but on reducing its importance, letting it exist without assigning it meaning. And this quiet neutrality allowed rest to continue steadily, night after night, supported by routine, familiarity, and the gradual trust that nothing more needed to be done. And as this neutrality settled fully into the background of nightly life, the experience of rest inside the castle became almost indistinguishable from the environment itself, as though sleep and stone were part of the same quiet system, operating together without friction. And this integration mattered because it removed the sense of opposition between the body and its surroundings, allowing people to rest without feeling as though they were enduring something hostile. And instead, they experienced the night as a continuation of the day's rhythm, slowed and softened rather than interrupted. And within this rhythm, the body learned to regulate itself efficiently, conserving warmth by reducing movement, slowing circulation at the extremities, and maintaining a steady core temperature through stillness and layered insulation. And these physiological responses were supported by habit rather than effort, emerging naturally once the environment was accepted rather than resisted. And as a result, sleep became more reliable even when temperatures were low, because the body was no longer reacting defensively. And this reliability reinforced trust in the nightly routine, further reducing mental engagement and allowing rest to deepen where possible. And even when sleep remained light or fragmented, it was sufficient, providing enough recovery to support the demands of the following day. And over time, this sufficiency became the standard by which rest was measured, not by comfort or duration, but by functionality. And within the castle, this standard was adequate, sustaining life and labor across long winters without requiring change. And so the night passed quietly once more, shaped by familiarity rather than comfort, and carried forward by the steady knowledge that what had worked before would work again, allowing the body to release itself into rest without expectation, resistance, or concern, trusting the routine to hold until morning returned. And as these nights accumulated one after another, the sense of time itself softened within the castle. Because when days were structured by light and work and nights by stillness and preservation, the boundary between one night and the next blurred gently, making sleep feel less like an isolated event and more like a recurring state that people entered and left without emphasis. And this continuity reduced pressure, since no single night needed to provide perfect rest, only enough recovery to move forward. And this perspective eased the experience of cold further, because discomfort was distributed across many nights rather than concentrated into one, allowing the body to adapt gradually without strain. And within this long rhythm, people rarely measured sleep by hours or depth, but by how they felt when they rose, whether movement returned easily, whether strength remained for the day's tasks. And if it did, then the night had done its work, regardless of how cold it had been. And this practical evaluation shaped attitudes toward rest, reinforcing the idea that adequacy mattered more than comfort, and that predictability mattered more than warmth. And so the routines surrounding sleep remained simple and consistent, avoiding unnecessary variation that might disrupt balance. And this simplicity extended even to thought, as people learned not to reflect on sleep itself, allowing it to happen without analysis. Because analysis brought awareness, and awareness brought tension, and tension brought cold more sharply into focus. And by letting go of that awareness, rest arrived more easily, supported by habit and familiarity rather than intention. And through this quiet letting go, the night passed steadily once more. Not remarkable, not difficult, simply another interval of stillness within the long life of the castle, carried forward by routines that had already proven themselves reliable across many winters. And with that long familiarity anchoring each night, the body began to treat the castle's cold not as a signal to remain alert, but as a constant that no longer required interpretation, allowing deeper relaxation to occur even when temperatures remained low. And this shift was subtle but important, because when the nervous system stopped scanning for change, muscles loosened more easily. Breathing settled into a slower rhythm, and the small reserves of warmth held by layered fabric and still air became more effective. And within this state, sleep did not need to be forced or pursued, but arrived gradually as attention drifted away from the outer world and toward internal quiet. And this drifting was supported by the absence of stimulation. Since nights and castles offered little light, little sound, and few demands, creating an environment where the mind could rest simply because there was nothing it needed to respond to. And even when discomfort remained present at the edges of awareness, it no longer dominated, because it carried no urgency. And urgency was what disrupted rest more than sensation itself. And over time, this calm response to cold strengthened, making each subsequent night easier to enter than the last. Not because conditions improved, but because resistance diminished. And this diminishing resistance allowed the body to conserve energy more effectively, preserving warmth through stillness rather than effort. And in this way, sleep became sustainable across long periods, supporting health and endurance without requiring warmth in excess. And as dawn approached once again, the transition out of rest remained slow and measured, matching the pace of the night itself, reinforcing the rhythm that defined castle life, where nothing happened quickly, and nothing needed to, because survival depended not on speed or comfort, but on patience, familiarity, and the steady repetition of practices that allowed people to rest reliably within cold stone walls. And as this patience continued to shape the experience of night, the boundary between sleeping and waking became softer, less defined by sharp transitions and more by gradual shifts in awareness, where rest ebbed and flowed rather than stopping and starting abruptly. And this softness allowed people to remain comfortable enough even when the cold pressed steadily against the outer layers of the bed, because the body did not interpret every sensation as a call to action, and instead allowed many of them to pass without response, preserving warmth and stillness. And this ability to remain unmoved by minor discomfort was learned slowly, reinforced each time a night passed without incident. And over months and years, it became a default state, making the cold less disruptive simply because it was no longer given attention. And within shared chambers, this collective calm deepened, as everyone settled into similar rhythms, reducing movement and noise, and by doing so, preserving the fragile equilibrium of temperature within the room. And this shared restraint created an environment where even small amounts of retained heat mattered, allowing bodies to support one another indirectly through stillness and proximity. And although this arrangement offered little in the way of privacy, it provided reliability, which was valued more highly, especially during winter. And as dawn approached and the air reached its coldest point, sleepers often remained wrapped tightly, lingering in bed until movement elsewhere in the castle signaled that the day was beginning. Because rising too early meant exposing the body to the cold without the immediate benefit of fire or activity. And so mornings began slowly, mirroring the nights that preceded them, reinforcing a rhythm that favored gradual change over sudden effort. And through this rhythm, people maintained their strength and endurance, not by seeking comfort, but by allowing rest to arrive naturally within the limits of their environment, accepting the cold as part of the setting rather than a problem to be solved. And this acceptance, repeated night after night, was what ultimately allowed people to sleep in medieval castles without freezing, sustained by habit, patience, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing the night well. And as this quiet confidence carried forward, the experience of sleeping within the castle became so normalized that it no longer stood apart from the rest of daily life, but blended seamlessly into it, with night treated not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a predictable interval governed by the same principles as the day, only slower and more inward. And this blending reduced mental strain, because nothing about the night required special attention once routines were in place, allowing people to conserve not only physical warmth but also emotional energy. And this conservation mattered across long winters, when fatigue accumulated gradually and recovery depended on steady, adequate rest rather than deep or luxurious sleep. And within this context, even modest improvements were appreciated not as comforts but as efficiencies, small refinements to a system that already worked, such as a slightly thicker blanket, a better fitting bed curtain, or a more sheltered sleeping position. And these refinements were absorbed quietly into routine without changing its character. And so the night remained largely the same across years, shaped by repetition rather than innovation. And this stability supported endurance, because bodies and minds adapt more easily to consistent conditions than to fluctuating ones. And as a result, people were able to function reliably despite the cold, carrying out daily tasks, maintaining health, and raising families within environments that never offered warmth in excess. And this reliability reinforced the belief that sleep did not need to be perfect to be effective, only sufficient and repeatable. And through this belief, the experience of rest remained grounded, practical, and unremarkable, allowing people to close their eyes each night within stone walls, knowing not that they would be comfortable, but that they would be fine. And that knowledge, more than any physical measure, was what carried them calmly through the cold hours until morning returned once again. And with that quiet assurance settled firmly into the fabric of everyday life, the final hours of the night inside the castle unfolded with very little awareness at all, as if the body itself had learned to carry the burden of cold without involving the mind, maintaining warmth through stillness, posture, and habit while attention drifted elsewhere. And this separation between sensation and concern was what ultimately allowed sleep to persist even when conditions remained far from comfortable. Because the cold no longer demanded interpretation or response, existing simply as part of the environment rather than an active force. And within this state, the small enclosed world of the bed remained stable, defined by the weight of coverings, the closeness of bodies when shared, and the steady rhythm of breathing that signaled continuity and safety. And as long as these signals remained unchanged, rest could continue uninterrupted, regardless of what the wider structure of the castle was doing around it. And this ability to ignore the larger environment was not accidental, but learned gradually through repetition, reinforced each time a night passed without harm, until trust replaced vigilance. And vigilance was no longer needed. And when dawn finally approached and the first faint light filtered through shutters or cracks, the body responded slowly, emerging from rest not with relief but with familiarity, knowing exactly what came next. And this predictability completed the cycle, linking night back to day without rupture. And in this way, the experience of sleeping in medieval castles remained sustainable across years and generations. Not because the cold was defeated, but because it was understood, anticipated, and quietly accommodated, allowing people to rest sufficiently within stone walls that were never warm, but consistently manageable through patience, routine, and an unspoken confidence built night after night. And beyond this point, the pattern remained unchanged, extending forward through countless ordinary nights that differed very little from one another, each one reinforcing the same quiet understanding that sleep did not require improvement so long as it remained dependable. And this dependability allowed people to carry their energy forward across seasons, trusting that the night would take care of itself if approached correctly. And so the castle after dark became a place of reduced expectation, where nothing new was sought and nothing old was challenged. And within this stillness, the body continued to perform its quiet work, redistributing warmth, slowing movement, and settling into positions that had proven effective over many repetitions. And this efficiency made the cold less noticeable, not because it diminished, but because it no longer disrupted the flow of rest. And as long as the routine held, sleep followed naturally, even if it remained light or uneven. And this lightness was not viewed as failure, because the purpose of sleep was not escape but recovery, and recovery could occur in many forms. And by dawn, that purpose had been met once again, allowing people to rise slowly and return to the work of the day without dwelling on the night that had passed. And this lack of emphasis was itself a sign of success, showing that the system worked well enough to disappear from attention. And through this quiet disappearance, the practice of sleeping in medieval castles sustained itself across generations, carried forward not by comfort or innovation, but by repetition, acceptance, and the steady confidence that the night would unfold as it always had, calmly and without incident. And as the night reaches its quiet conclusion within the castle, the patterns that have carried people safely through the cold remain unchanged, continuing without commentary or reflection. Because by this point, nothing new is required, only continuation. And so the body rests within familiar boundaries, supported by habits that no longer need attention. And as you remain here in this calm, steady rhythm, you might notice your own breathing has slowed. Your shoulders have softened, the weight of your own blankets pressing gently against you. The castle's cold feels distant now, a story from another time, but the lesson it carries remains. That rest does not require perfection, only steadiness. That warmth can be found not in temperature alone, but in familiarity, routine, and trust. And that the quiet continuation of familiar patterns is often enough to support sleep, letting the night unfold gently until it gives way once again to morning. The fire is nearly out now, only a faint red glow pulsing in the ash. The air is still, cool but not cruel. You take a slow breath, feeling your chest rise and fall. The quiet hums gently around you. Everything hard has softened. The night has done its work. Let your mind drift with it. Let the stories of the past fade into quiet memory. The cold, the stone, the curtain beds, all have done what they were meant to do. You have traveled through centuries of winter, and now you have arrived at peace. The last ember winks out, but the warmth remains. The silence that follows is gentle, like a blanket pulled to the chin. The earth is turning, the morning is coming, and you are safe within it. Good night. Sleep well.